Today, a similar debate rages in Black communities about the underlying causes of mass incarceration. While some argue that it is attributable primarily to racial bias and discrimination, others maintain that it is due to poor education, unraveling morals, and a lack of thrift and perseverance among the urban poor. Just as former slaves were viewed, even among some African Americans, as unworthy of full citizenship due to their lack of education and good morals, today, similar arguments can be heard from Black people across the political spectrum who believe that reform efforts should be focused on moral uplift and education for ghetto dwellers, rather than challenging the system of mass incarceration itself. Scholars, activists, and community members who argue that moral uplift and education provide the best solution to Black criminality and the phenomenon of mass incarceration have been influenced by what Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham has called the politics of respectability, a politics that was born in the 19th century and matured in the Jim Crow era. This political strategy is predicated on the notion that the goal of racial equality can only be obtained if Black people are able to successfully prove to whites that they are worthy of equal treatment, dignity, and respect. Supporters of the politics of respectability believe that African Americans, if they hope to be accepted by whites, must conduct themselves in a fashion that elicits respect and sympathy rather than fear and anger from other races. They must demonstrate through words and deeds their ability to live by and aspire to the same moral codes as the white middle class, even while they are being discriminated against wrongly. And the basic theory underlying this strategy is that white Americans will abandon discriminatory practices if and when it becomes apparent that Black people aren't inferior after all. The politics of respectability made sense to many Black reformers during the Jim Crow era, since African Americans had no vote, could not change policy, and lived under the constant threat of the Klan. Back then, the only thing Black people could control was their own behavior. Many believed they simply had no choice, no realistic option but to cooperate with the caste system while conducting themselves in such a dignified and respectable manner that it would eventually become obvious to whites that their bigotry was misplaced. This strategy worked to some extent for a segment of the African American community, particularly those who had access to education and relative privilege. But a much larger segment, those who were uneducated and desperately poor, found themselves unable, as one historian put it, to conform to the gender roles, public behavior, and economic activity deemed legitimate by bourgeois America, but which the forces of Jim Crow sought to prevent Black people from achieving. In many cases, the relatively privileged Black elite turned against the Black urban poor, condemning them and distancing themselves, while at the same time presenting themselves as legitimate spokespeople for the disadvantaged. It was a pattern that would repeat itself in cities throughout the United States as Black communities found themselves embroiled in deep conflict over goals and strategies pursued by the Black elite. What happened in Atlanta in the wake of the New Deal is a case in point. During Jim Crow, all Black people in Atlanta were bound together by the racial caste system, but there was a significant group of African Americans who were well educated and had influence in the halls of power. Numerous Black colleges were located in Atlanta, and the city was home to the South's largest population of college-educated African Americans. Members of this relatively elite group believed they could prove their respectability to white Americans and often blamed less educated Blacks for sabotaging their quest for racial equality, especially when they committed crimes or failed to conform to white middle-class norms of dress, cleanliness, and behavior. In the view of these Black elites, a poverty complex plagued the Black poor, one that made them politically apathetic and content with broken down, overcrowded, and dirty living conditions. For decades, Black elites engaged in private rescue efforts to make Black communities tidy, clean, and respectable in a futile effort to gain white approval. Eventually, these rescue efforts gave way to Black endorsement of harmful policies aimed at the urban poor. In the 1930s and early 1940s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt began to roll out the New Deal, a massive public works and investment program designed to lift the nation out of a severe depression. Almost immediately, Black elites recognized the opportunity for the individual and collective advancement of Negroes who could present themselves favorably to whites. Some Black Atlantans were brought from the margins into the sphere of opportunity by New Deal programs, but most were left behind. As historian Karen Ferguson observes, when Black reformers had the opportunity to determine the recipients of New Deal largesse, they did not choose the mudsills of the Black working class, but rather the more prosperous elements who were more able to be respectable according to the reformers' vision. Far from prioritizing the needs of the least advantaged, many black reformers began aggressively pursuing policy reforms that would benefit the black elite to the detriment of the poorest segments of the black community. Some of the most discriminatory federal programs of the New Deal era, including the slum clearance program, received strong support from African American bureaucrats and reformers who presented themselves as speaking for the black community as a whole. Although many poor African Americans rejected the philosophies, tactics, and strategies of the black elite, ultimately moral uplift ideology became the new common sense, not just in Atlanta, but in cities nationwide. The tensions and debates between black reformers struggling to improve and uplift the slum dwellers and those committed to challenging discrimination and Jim Crow directly played out over and over again. Black elites found they had much to gain by positioning themselves as race managers, and many poor African Americans became persuaded that perhaps their degraded status was, after all, their own fault. Given this history, it should come as no surprise that today, some black mayors, politicians, and lobbyists, as well as preachers, teachers, barbers, and ordinary folk, endorse get tough tactics and spend more time chastising the urban poor for their behavior than seeking meaningful policy solutions to the appalling conditions in which they are forced to live and raise their children. The fact that many African Americans endorse aspects of the current caste system and insist that the problems of the urban poor can be best explained by their behavior, culture, and attitude does not, in any meaningful way, distinguish mass incarceration from its predecessors. To the contrary, these attitudes and arguments have their roots in the struggles to end slavery and Jim Crow. Many African Americans today believe that uplift ideology worked in the past and ought to work again, forgetting that ultimately it took a major movement to end the last caste system, not simply good behavior. Many black people are confused, and the black community itself is divided about how best to understand and respond to mass incarceration. A seemingly colorblind system has emerged that locks millions of African Americans into a permanent undercaste, and it appears that those who are trapped within it could have avoided it simply by not committing crimes. Isn't the answer not to challenge the system, but to try to avoid it? Shouldn't the locus be on improving ourselves rather than challenging a biased system? Familiar questions are asked decades after the end of the old Jim Crow. Once again, complicity with the prevailing system of control may seem like the only option. Parents and school teachers counsel black children that if they ever hope to escape this system and avoid prison time, they must be on their best behavior, raise their arms and spread their legs for the police without complaint, stay in failing schools, pull up their pants, and refuse all forms of illegal work and money-making activity, even if jobs in the legal economy are impossible to find. Girls are told not to have children until they are married to a good black man who can help provide for a family with a legal job. They are told to wait, and wait for Mr. Right, even if that means in a jobless ghetto, never having children at all, when black youth find it difficult or impossible to live up to these standards, or when they fail, stumble, and make mistakes, as all humans do, shame and blame is heaped upon them. If only they had made different choices, they're told sternly they wouldn't be sitting in a jail cell, they'd be graduating from college. Never mind that white children on the other side of town who made precisely the same choices, often for less compelling reasons, are in fact going to college. The genius of the current caste system, and what most distinguishes it from its predecessors, is that it appears voluntary. People choose to commit crimes, and that's why they are locked up or locked out, we are told. This feature makes the politics of responsibility particularly tempting, as it appears the system can be avoided with good behavior. But herein lies the trap. All people make mistakes. All of us are sinners. All of us are criminals. All of us violate the law at some point in our lives. In fact, if the worst thing you have ever done is speed 10 miles over the speed limit on the freeway, you have put yourself and others at more risk of harm than someone smoking marijuana in the privacy of his or her living room. Yet there are people in the United States serving life sentences for first-time drug offenses, something virtually unheard of anywhere else in the world. The notion that a vast gulf exists between criminals and those of us who have never served time in prison is a fiction created by the racial ideology that birthed mass incarceration, namely that there is something fundamentally wrong and morally inferior about them. The reality, though, is that all of us have done wrong. As noted earlier, studies suggest that most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Indeed, most of us break the law not once, but repeatedly throughout our lives. Yet, Only some of us will be arrested, charged, convicted of a crime, branded a criminal or felon, and ushered into a permanent undercast, who becomes a social pariah and excommunicated from civil society, and who trots off to college bears scant relationship to the morality of crimes committed. Who is more blameworthy? The young black kid who hustles on the street corner selling weed to help his mama pay the rent, or the college kid who deals drugs out of his dorm room so that he'll have cash to finance his spring break? Who should we fear? The kid in the hood who joined a gang and now carries a gun for security because his neighborhood is frightening and unsafe? Or the suburban high school student who has a drinking problem but keeps getting behind the wheel? Our racially biased system of mass incarceration exploits the fact that all people break the law and make mistakes at various points in their lives and with varying degrees of justification. Screwing up, failing to live by one's highest ideals and values is part of what makes us human. Urging the urban, poor, or anyone to live up to their highest ideals and values is a good thing, as it demonstrates confidence in the ability of all people to stretch, grow, and evolve. Even in the most dire circumstances, we all have power and agency, the ability to choose what we think and how we respond to the circumstances of our lives. Moreover, we all have duties and responsibilities to each other, not the least of which is to do no harm. We ought never excuse violence or tolerate behavior that jeopardizes the safety and security of others, just as all people, no matter who they are or what they have done, ought to be regarded as having basic human rights to work, housing, education, and food. Residents of all communities have a basic human right to safety and security. The intuition underlying moral uplift strategies is fundamentally sound. Our communities will never thrive if we fail to respect ourselves and one another. As a liberation strategy, however, the politics of responsibility is doomed to tail. Not because there is something especially wrong with those locked in ghettos or prisons today, but because there is nothing special about them. They are merely human. They will continue to make mistakes and break the law for reasons that may or may not be justified. And as long as they do so, this system of mass incarceration will continue to function well. Generations of black men will continue to be lost, rounded up for crimes that go ignored on the other side of town, and ushered into a permanent second-class status. It may seem at first blush that cooperating with the system while urging good behavior is the only option available, but in reality, it is not a liberation strategy at all. Fork in the road. Du Bois got it right a century ago. The burden belongs to the nation, and the hands of none of us are clean if we bend not our energies to righting these great wrongs. The reality is that just a few decades after the collapse of one caste system, we constructed another. Our nation declared a war on people trapped in racially segregated ghettos just at the moment their economies had collapsed, rather than providing community investment, quality education, and job training when work disappeared. Of course, those communities are suffering from serious crime and dysfunction today. Did we expect otherwise? Did we think that miraculously they would thrive? And now, having waged this war for decades, we claim some blacks support mass incarceration as though they would rather have their young men warehoused in prison than going off to college. As political theorist Tommy Shelby has observed, individuals are forced to make choices in an environment they did not choose. They would surely prefer to have a broader array of good opportunities. The question we should be asking, not instead of, but in addition to questions about penal policy, is whether the citizens of the ghetto are entitled to a better set of options, and if so, whose responsibility it is to provide them. Clearly, a much better set of options could be provided to African Americans and poor people of all colors today. As historian Lerone Bennett Jr. eloquently reminds us, a nation is a choice. We could choose to be a nation that extends care, compassion, and concern to those who are locked up and locked out or headed for prison before they are old enough to vote. We could seek for them the same opportunities we seek for our own children. We could treat them like one of us. We could do that. Or we can choose to be a nation that shames and blames its most vulnerable, at badges of dishonor upon them at young ages, and then relegates them to a permanent second-class status for life. That is the path we have chosen, and it leads to a familiar place. We faced a fork in the road 1 decade after Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were laid to rest. As described in Chapter 1, during the late 1970s, jobs had suddenly disappeared from urban areas across America, and unemployment rates had skyrocketed. In 1954, black and white youth unemployment rates in America were equal, with blacks actually having a slightly higher rate of employment in the age group 16 to 19. By 1984, however, the black unemployment rate had nearly quadrupled, while the white rate had increased only marginally. This was not due to a major change in black values, behavior, or culture. This dramatic shift was the result of deindustrialization, globalization, and technological advancement. Urban factories shut down as our nation transitioned to a service economy. Suddenly, African Americans were trapped in jobless ghettos, desperate for work. The economic collapse of inner-city black communities could have inspired a national outpouring of compassion and support. A new war on poverty could have been launched. Economic stimulus packages could have sailed through Congress to bail out those trapped in jobless ghettos through no fault of their own. Education, job training, public transportation, and relocation assistance could have been provided so that youth of color would have been able to survive the rough transition to a new global economy and secure jobs in distant suburbs. Constructive interventions would have been good not only for African Americans trapped in ghettos, but also for blue-collar workers of all colors, many of whom were suffering too, if less severely. A wave of compassion and concern could have flooded poor and working-class communities in honor of the late Martin Luther King Jr. All of this could have happened, but it didn't. Instead, we declared a war on drugs. The collapse of inner-city economies coincided with the conservative backlash against the civil rights movement, resulting in the perfect storm. Almost overnight, black men found themselves unnecessary to the American economy and demonized by mainstream society. No longer needed to pick cotton in the fields or labor in factories, lower-class black men were hauled off to prison in droves. They were vilified in the media and condemned for their condition as part of a well-orchestrated political campaign to build a new white Republican majority in the South. Decades later, curious onlookers in the grips of denial would wonder aloud, where have all the black men gone? No one has made this point better than sociologist Loic Wacquant. Wacquant has written extensively about the cyclical nature of racial caste in America. He emphasizes that the one thing that makes the current penal apparatus strikingly different from previous racial caste systems is that it does not carry out the positive economic mission of recruitment and disciplining of the workforce. Instead, it serves only to warehouse poor black and brown people for increasingly lengthy periods of time, often until old age. The new system does not seek primarily to benefit unfairly from black labor, as earlier caste systems have, but instead views African Americans as largely irrelevant and unnecessary to the newly structured economy, an economy that is no longer driven by unskilled labor. It is fair to say that we have witnessed an evolution in the United States from a racial caste system based entirely on exploitation, slavery, to one based largely on subordination, Jim Crow, to one defined by marginalization, mass incarceration. While marginalization may sound far preferable to exploitation, it may prove to be even more dangerous. Extreme marginalization, as we have seen throughout world history, poses the risk of extermination. Tragedies such as the Holocaust in Germany or ethnic cleansing in Bosnia are traceable to the extreme marginalization and stigmatization of racial and ethnic groups. As legal scholar John A. Powell once commented, only half in jest, it's actually better to be exploited than marginalized, in some respects, because if you're exploited, presumably you are still needed. Viewed in this light, the frantic accusations of genocide by poor blacks in the early years of the war on drugs seem less paranoid. The intuition of those residing in ghetto communities that they had suddenly become disposable was rooted in real changes in the economy, changes that have been devastating to poor black communities as factories have closed, low-skilled jobs have disappeared, and all those who had the means to flee the ghetto did. The sense among those left behind that society no longer has use for them, and that the government now aims simply to get rid of them, reflects a reality that many of us who claim to care prefer to avoid simply by changing channels. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. One love.